1978, whenever the name Guyana was mentioned, only one thing came to mind, and that cast a grim aura over the entire nation. That one thing was Jonestown. More than 900 people trusted one man, and that trust led to their deaths. Today we will be focusing on the massacre that put all of the world's eyes on our small country Guyana, but not for a good reason. On May the 13th, 1931, James Warren Jones was born to his parents in Crete, Indiana. He is widely known as Jim Jones. Now his parents, their names were James Thurman Jones and Lynette Jones. James Sr., he was a veteran from the Great War, and he was living on disability because he became injured when he was exposed to mustard gas. While his wife, Lynette, she was a feisty, independent woman who did not believe in God. And that was one of the major differences between her and her husband. James Sr. believed in God, but Lynette, she was not religious. Now, in his younger days, Jim Jones would describe himself as a hellion, and he said that persons would think of him as the trash of the neighborhood. That was because he was very poor. He didn't have much money. So, when you don't have money, persons consider you as trash. Jim was somewhat of a young savior because he was known to fight off those bullies who were attacking other children. He also was known to rescue stray animals, and he also took in beggars and poor into his home and looked after them. Now, one thing about Jim is that he was an avid churchgoer even in his younger days. He attended Quaker, Nazarene, Methodist, Apostolic, and even the Church of Christ, and he was known to throw himself completely into those churches until he became disillusioned and would move on. While in high school, Jim continued to stand up from the other children. Most times he was seen carrying his Bible. Jim would frequently confront other children about their beer drinking, their dancing, smoking, and that caused him to even alienate himself more. In 1945, Jim's parents separated and eventually divorced. So Jim and his mother moved from Crete to Richmond, Indiana, where he attended Richmond High School and eventually graduated with an interest in medicine in 1948. Now, when his parents divorced, the family no longer supported Lynette. So Jim now had to try and get a job to help support himself and his mother. So he became employed at the Richmond Reed Hospital. While working as a hospital orderly, James met Marceline Baldwin, who would become his girlfriend. Now, after graduating in November 1948 from high school, Jim moved to Bloomington, Indiana, where he attended university, and that university was Indiana University, Bloomington. Now, he went there with the intention of becoming a doctor, but eventually he lost interest in the whole medicine field and he just did something else. During his time at university, Jim was impressed by a speech given by Eleanor Roosevelt, and it was on the plight of African Americans, and this was when he began to support communism and other radical political views for the first time. Jim and Marceline continued their relationship while he was in college and while she was working as a nurse, and eventually they got married on June the 12th, 1949. So Jim and Marceline's first home was in Bloomington, and like every marriage, their marriage was not perfect, but their biggest argument was because of the fact that Marceline was a Methodist and Jim did not support the Methodist idea of radical segregation. Jim insisted that they attend the Bloomington Full Gospel Tabernacle, but eventually he compromised and began attending the local Methodist church on Sundays. But despite attending church on most Sundays, Jim pressed his wife privately to completely disregard God and accept atheism. After attending Indiana University for 2 years, Jim and Marceline decided to relocate to Indianapolis in 1951. He took night classes at Butler University and eventually graduated with a degree in secondary education. In 1951, now that Jim Jones was 20 years old, he began to attend gatherings of Communist Party USA in Indianapolis. Now, because he became affiliated with the Communist Party, Jim and his family were now being harassed by the government. Now, because of this harassment, Jim became frustrated with the treatment of the communists in America, and he asked himself this question: how can I demonstrate my Marxism And that's when the thought hit him by infiltrating the church. And it was at this moment that Jim began his ministry. Jim announced to his wife and family that he was joining the ministry in 1952, and he became a Methodist minister since he believed that the church was ready to put socialism into practice. In the summer of 1952, Jim became a student pastor at the Somerset Methodist Church in a poor, predominantly white neighborhood. He launched a project to create a playground that was open to children of all races, so no segregation. By the following year, Jim had made a name for himself, and he was known in Indianapolis as a healer and an evangelist. Now, Jim was interested in holding radically integrated services, but the church was not in agreement with this. So in early 1954, Jim was fired from the church. Now, according to the church, Jim was fired because he was stealing funds. But according to Jim, he was fired because he wanted to integrate African Americans into the congregation. Now, segregation was a major source of Jim's unhappiness in mainstream churches. During the 1950s and early 1960s, segregation was widespread across America, and so many churches kept the whites away from the blacks. And having grown up as an outsider himself, Jim empathized with the downtrodden, the poor, and the non-whites of the community. He preached integration and racial equality, and his own family reflected these beliefs. During their life together, Jim and Marceline adopted many non-white children, and they referred to their family as the Rainbow Family. Jim had stated, "Integration is a more personal thing with me now. It's a question of my son's future." Now, Jim's interest in anti-racism began when he was in high school, and he witnessed some African Americans being discriminated against at a football game that was hosted by his school. So the first child that Jim and Marceline adopted was Agnes, and this was in 1954, and she was part Native American. In 1959, they adopted 3 Korean American children, and these were Levi, Stephanie, and Susan. They even encouraged their temple members to adopt as many children as they could. However, sadly, Stephanie Jones, one of their adopted daughters, would die in a tragic car accident the same year of her adoption. Now, 1 month after Stephanie's death, Jim and Marceline gave birth to their first biological child, who they named Stephen Gandhi. 2 years later, in 1961, Jim and Marceline became the first white couple in Indiana to ever adopt a black child. That child was named Jim Jones Jr. They even went on to adopt one of the temple members' children, who was originally named Timothy Glenn Topper, but they shortened his name to Tim. As part of his teachings, Jim discouraged any sexual or romantic relationships among his temple members, but those rules did not apply to him because Jim was known to have several adulterous relationships, one of which was with the church administrator Carolyn Layton, and they had a son who they named Jim John. Jim also claimed that he was the son of another temple member, Grace Stowen's son, John Victor. But she and her husband adamantly denied that he ever fathered this child. Jim also sought to disrupt familial bonds by calling himself Father of All. Jim began the People's Temple informally in 1955 as just an independent congregation in Indianapolis. He was inspired by the idea of a just society that could overcome racism and poverty. Although Jim was white, he attracted mostly African Americans to the group with the vision of an integrated congregation. In 1960, the People's Temple became affiliated with the Christian Church or Disciples of Christ, and 4 years later, Jim was ordained as a minister. So how did Jonestown come about? In 1961, Jim started to warn his congregation that he was having visions of a nuclear attack that would come and destroy Indianapolis. At the time, Marceline was confiding in her friends that Jim was becoming increasingly paranoid and fearful. At the time, there was a man by the name of William Branham, and he had prophesied the destruction of the United States. This was also what influenced Jim Jones. This resulted in Jim starting to look for an escape from the destruction that he believed was on its way. He ended up reading in an Esquire magazine that South America was the best place and the safest place to escape to from the destruction of the war that was on its way. So Jim decided to travel to South America to look for a place for the People's Temple to relocate. On his way to Brazil, Jim actually stopped in Guyana, and he was in Georgetown where he held revival meetings. As the years progressed, Jim became more and more paranoid about the impending nuclear war that was on its way to destroy Indianapolis. And at this time, this was the height of the Cold War. The People's Temple chose Guyana to relocate to because of the group's own socialist politics. And as time progressed, they were moving further and further to the left. A former Temple member, Tim Carter, stated that the reasons for choosing Guyana were the Temple's views of a perceived dominance of racism and multinational cooperations in the U.S. government. According to Carter, the Temple concluded that Guyana, an English-speaking socialist country with a predominantly indigenous population and with a government including prominent black leaders, would afford black Temple members a peaceful place to live. Later, the Guyanese Prime Minister at the time, Lyndon Forbes Burnham, stated that Jones may have wanted to use cooperatives as the basis for the establishment of socialism, and maybe his idea of setting up a commune meshed with that. Jim also believed that Guyana was small, poor, independent enough for him to obtain influence and official protection. Jim was skillful in presenting the Guyanese government with the benefits of having the People's Temple agricultural project settle in Guyana. One of the main tactics was to speak of the advantages of their American presence near Guyana's disputed border with Venezuela. This idea seemed promising to the Guyana government since they were fearful of attack from Venezuela. In 1974, after traveling to an area in northwest Guyana with Guyanese officials, Jones and the Temple negotiated a lease of over 3,800 acres of land in the jungle located 150 miles west of Georgetown. The site was isolated and had low soil fertility by Guyana standards. The nearest body of water was 7 miles away by muddy roads. Jonestown was located not far from Guyana's disputed border with Venezuela. So the Guyanese government was hoping that the presence of the Americans would deter the invasion from Venezuela. By 1977, James became even more paranoid because of the media's scrutiny of the activities of the People's Temple, and that's when him and his members decided it was time to move. As 500 people began the construction of Jonestown, the temple encouraged more and more people to relocate to the settlement. Jones saw Jonestown as a socialist paradise and a sanctuary from media scrutiny. In the summer of 1977, Jim and several hundreds of his temple members escaped to Jonestown to escape the building pressures of the San Francisco media investigation. Jones left the same night that an editor at New West magazine read him an article to be published by Marshall Kilduff detailing allegations of abuse by former temple members. After the mass migration, Jonestown became overcrowded. At its peak in 1978, Jonestown had a population of over 900 members. Many temple members believed that Guyana would be, as promised by Jim, a utopia or paradise. After Jim arrived, however, Jonestown significantly changed. Entertaining movies from Georgetown, which the settlers had watched, were replaced and completely cancelled in favor of Soviet propaganda shorts and documentaries on American social problems. Bureaucratic requirements after Jim arrived sapped labor resources for other needs. Buildings fell into despair and weeds encroached on fields. School studies and nighttime lectures for adults turned into Jim's discussions about revolution and enemies, with lessons focusing on Soviet alliances, Jones' crisis, and the purported mercenaries sent by Tim Stone, who was a defected temple member that turned against the group. For the first several months, temple members worked 6 days a week, from approximately 6:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. with 1 hour for lunch. Sometime around mid-1978, Jim's health began to deteriorate and his wife took over the day-to-day operations. She had more hand in the operations and she reduced the work week to 5 days a week for just 8 hours a day. After the work days ended, the temple members were instructed to attend several hours of activities in the pavilions, and this included classes on socialism. Jim had recorded readings of the news and he had these blasting over the PA system whole day, every day. So anywhere the temple members go, that was all they were hearing. The only way of non-postal communication with the outside world was through a short-wave radio. The radio was used to order large quantities of commodities like wheat, because remember I had mentioned earlier that the soil was not great. Now, even though the People's Temple had access to approximately $28 million by the end of 1978, Jim still had his temple members living in small communal houses. And the meals that they ate comprised of rice, beans, greens, and occasionally they got meat, sauces, and eggs. He himself lived in a small communal house, but it had less people than the other houses. His house reportedly had a small refrigerator that at times it was stocked with eggs, meats, fruits, salads, and soft drinks. And because of the communal living, whenever a medical problem came out or a spread of a disease, it would be devastating. In February of 1978, half of the community would be struck with diarrhea and high fevers. Now, Jonestown didn't have a prison system, but persons that did exhibit disciplinary problems, they were punished. They would either be imprisoned in a 6x4x3 plywood box, or they would have to spend the night at the bottom of a well, sometimes upside down, or they would have to endure beating. But these were only some of the rumors that were spread among the Guyanese population, so this cannot be 100% confirmed. So remember, life in Jonestown was not all that it was cracked up to be, so persons did try to escape. And for those who tried to escape, they would be drugged out with thorazine, sodium pentothal, chloral hydrate, Dermarol, and Valium, and placed in an extended care unit. I don't know what happened while they were in this care unit. Any children that were born in Jonestown were surrendered to communal care, and they were only allowed to see their biological parents for a few hours in the night. Jim was called father or dad by both adults and children. The community had a nursery where 33 children were born. Jonestown was made up of approximately 70 African Americans, 24.6 whites, 3.9 mixed race, and 2.3 of the other races. Let's just run through some events that could have led to the tragic events of today's story. So the first thing are white night rehearsals. Jones frequently addressed his temple members regarding Jonestown's safety, and that included statements that the CIA and other intelligence agencies were working with capitalist pigs to destroy the settlement and harm its inhabitants. During such events, Jim would give his temple members 4 options. Either they attempt to flee to the Soviet Union, commit revolutionary suicide, stay in Jonestown and fight the purported attackers, or flee into the jungle. The group would have to vote on their choice, and a survivor of Jonestown stated that on at least 2 occasions, when the group voted at these white night rehearsals, they voted for revolutionary suicide. And after they made this vote, they took part in a practice suicide where they would all line up, be given a cup of Kool-Aid, and then be told to just drink it and relax. Another event that occurred was the Stowen custody dispute. Earlier, I had mentioned that Jim claimed to be the father of John Stowen, the son of Grace Stowen, a temple member. Grace, along with her husband Tim, got into a custody battle in a Georgetown court to have their 5-year-old returned to them. 2 orders were issued to Jim, and the second was to have John taken into protective custody. Jim Jones was fearful of being held in contempt of court, so he set up a fake sniper attack on himself. He then began a series of white nights, which he called the 6-day siege. During the siege, he spoke to his members about attacks from outsiders, and so he had his temple members surround Jonestown with guns and machetes. Jim was convinced that the Guyana Defense Force would invade Jonestown, but the then Deputy Minister Reed assured Marceline Jones that there was no intention of the GDF to attack Jonestown. Another thing that occurred was that Jim started to explore other options for an exit. After the 6-day siege, Jim didn't believe Guyana was safe anymore, so he started looking for somewhere else for the People's Temple to relocate to. He instructed his temple members to write to over a dozen foreign governments to find out about their immigration policies. Although the executive members and the congregation voiced their thoughts about moving their operations to the Soviet Union, Jim eventually changed his mind. He stated that he preferred to stay within the Guyanese border because of the sovereignty it afforded them. Another thing that occurred was the creation of the Concerned Relatives. Tim and Grace Stone, along with other defected temple members and family of present temple members, formed a group known as Concerned Relatives. They wrote letters to the U.S. Secretary of State and the Guyanese government, begging for an investigation into the People's Temple and Jonestown to begin. And this was the event that brought attention back to Jonestown. Another thing was the declining of Jim's health. In 1978, Jim was informed of a possible lung infection, but he went on to inform his temple members that he had lung cancer. This was a ploy to foster sympathy and to strengthen support within the community. It was reported that Jim had begun abusing injectables like Valium, Quaaludes, stimulants, and barbiturates. In an audio tape recording of one of the meetings in 1978, Jim reportedly stated that he was suffering from high blood pressure, small strokes, weight loss, temporary blindness, convulsions, and grotesque swelling of the extremities, and even chronic insomnia. So when the Concerned Relatives wrote these letters, there was now concerns to visit Jonestown. Leo Ryan, who represented California's 11th Congressional District, announced that he would visit Jonestown. Ryan was friends with the father of Bob Houston, a temple member in California whose mutilated body was found along train tracks on October the 5th, 1978. And this was only 3 days after a taped telephone conversation with Houston's ex-wife in which leaving the temple was discussed. Over the following months, Ryan's interest continued to peak as he received reports from Stowens, Layton, and other concerned relatives. On November the 14th, 1978, Leo Ryan, along with 19 other individuals, flew to Jonestown. They were initially denied entrance into Jonestown, but by November the 17th, Jim Jones was informed that whether he liked it or not, Ryan, along with his delegation, would be entering Jonestown. Mark Lane and Charles R. Gary, representatives of Jonestown, accompanied Leo Ryan and his delegation to Jonestown through an airstrip at Port Kaituma, 6 miles away from Jonestown. Only Ryan and 3 other members were initially allowed into Jonestown. The rest had to remain outside until after sunset. That night, they attended a musical reception in the settlement's main pavilion. While the party was received warmly, Jones said that he felt like a dying man and ranted about government conspiracies and martyrdom as he decried attacks by the press and his enemies. It was later reported and verified by audio tapes that Jim had run rehearsals on how to convince Ryan and his delegations that everybody was happy and in good spirits in Jonestown. 2 temple members, Vernon Gosney and Monica Bagby, made the first move for a defection that night. In the pavilion, Gosney mistook Harris for Ryan and passed him a note that said, "Dear Congressman, Vernon Gosney and Monica Bagby, please help us get out of Jonestown." A child nearby witnessed Gosney's act and verbally alerted the other temple members. Harris brought 2 notes to Leo Ryan and Spire, one of them Gosney's. According to Spire, reading the notes, her and the congressman started realizing that something was very, very wrong. In the early morning of November the 18th, 11 temple members sensed that there was danger ahead, enough that they left Jonestown and made their way to a nearby settlement, Matthews Ridge. This was in the opposite direction of the Port Kaituma airstrip. Those defectors included members of the family of Jonestown's head of security, Joe Wilson. When journalists and members of the concerned relatives group arrived later that day, Marceline Jones gave them a tour of this settlement. That afternoon, the Parks and Bogo families, along with in-laws Christopher O'Neill and Harold Cordell, stepped forward and asked to be escorted out of Jonestown by the Ryan delegation. When Jim Jones' adopted son Johnny attempted to talk Parks out of leaving, Parks said, "No way, it's nothing but a communist prison camp." Jim Jones gave permission to the two families, along with Vernon Gosby and Monica Bagby, permission to leave. When Harris handed Gosney's note to Jim Jones in an interview in the pavilion, Jim stated that Gosney was lying and was just trying to tarnish the reputation of Jonestown. After a sudden violent rainstorm, the emotions between family members began to erupt. Al Simon, a Native American, took two of his children to Leo Ryan to begin processing paperwork to have them taken back to the United States. Al's wife Bonnie went on the loudspeaker of the People's Temple and informed all of the members that she was denouncing her husband. Al pleaded with his wife Bonnie to return to the United States with them, but she denied. She didn't want to leave the People's Temple. So now we're going to talk about what happened at the Port Kaituma airstrip. So while the Ryan delegation was beginning to make their way to the Port Kaituma airstrip, Ryan, along with Dwyer, remained back at Jonestown to continue processing paperwork for defectors. Shortly before the dump truck left for the airstrip, Temple loyalist Larry Layton, the brother of Deborah Layton, decided that he wanted to join the group. Several of the defectors voiced their suspicions about why Larry wants to join their group. Remember, he is a Temple loyalist. So why is he all of a sudden wanting to defect? Shortly after the dump truck left, Temple member Don Sly grabbed Ryan while he was wielding a knife. While Ryan remained unhurt because others wrestled Don to the ground, Dwyer strongly suggested that the Congressman leave Jonestown and file a criminal complaint against Don. Ryan followed the advice of Dwyer and he left and he filed a complaint, but he told him that he would return later. So the truck had already departed, but when they heard about the attack on Ryan, they stopped and took him as a passenger and then continued their journey to the airstrip. The entourage had originally scheduled a 19-passenger Twin Otter from Guyana Airways to transport them back to Georgetown. Because of the defectors, the group grew in numbers, so they had to have an additional aircraft to transport them back to Georgetown. So the U.S. Embassy arranged for an additional plane, a 6-passenger Cessna, to be provided for them. But when the entourage reached the airstrip sometime between 4:30 and 4:45, the planes had not arrived as yet. So the group had to wait until approximately 5:10, and that's when the airplane arrived, and then they began to board. Layton was a passenger on the Cessna, and this was the first aircraft to take off. After the Cessna had taxied to the far end of the airstrip, Layton produced a handgun and started to shoot at the passenger. He wounded Bagby and Gusby and tried to kill Dale Parks, who disarmed him after the gun misfired. Meanwhile, some of the passengers had already boarded the Twin Otter, and that's when a tractor with a trailer attached with Temple members arrived at the airstrip and approached the Twin Otter. When the tractor neared within about 30 feet of the plane, the Red Brigade started shooting at the aircraft, and there were at least 2 shooters who circled the airplane on foot. Now, the shooting of the Cessna and the shooting of the Twin Otter were at approximately the same time. So there were approximately 9 shooters, but all of them cannot be identified. But those that were identified were Joe Wilson, Stanley Gregg, Tom Keiss Sr., and Ronnie Dennis. So those were some of the shooters from the Red Brigade. The first few seconds of the shooting were captured on U-Matic ENG videotape by NBC cameraman Bob Brown, and this was before he was killed along with Robinson Harris and Temple defector Patricia Parks in a few minutes of shooting. Leo Ryan was killed after being shot over 20 times. Those injured in and around the Twin Otter were Jackie Spire, Song, Dwyer, Rederman, Anthony Katsaris, Boyd, Oliver, Krause, and Javers. After the shootings, the Cessna's pilot, Tom Fernandez, along with the pilot and co-pilot of the Twin Otter, Captain Guy Spence, and First Officer Astel Rodwell Paul, as well as the injured Monica Bagby, fled in the Cessna to Georgetown. The damaged Twin Otter and the injured Ryan delegation members were left on the airstrip. Before leaving Jonestown for the airstrip, Ryan had told Gary that he would write a report describing Jonestown in basically good terms. Ryan stated that none of the 60 relatives he had targeted for interviews wanted to leave. The 14 defectors constituted a very small portion of Jonestown residents, and that any sense of imprisonment the defectors had was likely because of peer pressure and a lack of physical transportation. And even if 200 of the 900 plus wanted to leave, I'd still say you have a beautiful place here. Despite Gary's report, Jim reportedly stated that I have failed. And even though Gary reiterated that Leo Ryan was going to make a positive report about Jonestown, Jim continued to say that all is lost. After Ryan departed Jonestown for Port Kaituma, Marceline Jones made a broadcast on the public address system stating that all was well and everyone should return to their homes. During this time, aides prepared a large metal tub with grape-flavored Kool-Aid, poisoned with diphenhydramine, promethazine, chlorpromazine, chloroquine, chloral hydrate, Valium, and cyanide. The concoction was prepared with the help of Jonestown in-house doctor, Dr. Larry Scott, and he was a Texas native and a former methamphetamine addict who got sober with the help of Jim Jones. And Jim had subsequently paid for his college education to become a doctor. Scott had been researching the best way for a person to die in advance for the foreseen mass suicide. About 30 minutes after Marceline had made her announcement, Jim went back onto the system and made another announcement calling for all members to go to the pavilion. A 44-minute cassette tape known as the Death Tape had recorded Jim Jones' speech and his meeting the night of November the 18th, 1978. When the assembly gathered, Jones told his congregation about the Ryan's delegation air travel back to Georgetown. And he said, "One of those people on that plane is going to shoot the pilot. I know that. I didn't plan it, but I know it's going to happen. They're going to shoot that pilot, and down comes the plane into the jungle. And we had better not have any of our children left when it's over, because they'll parachute in here on us." Parroting Jim Jones' prior statements that hostile forces would convert the captured children to fascism, one of the members stated, "The ones that they take captured, they're gonna just let them grow up and be dummies." On the tape, Jim Jones urged his temple members to commit revolutionary suicide. But one of the temple members, Christine Miller, argued that the temple members should try to attempt airlift to the Soviet Union. Jim McElvain, a former therapist who had only arrived to Jonestown 2 days prior, assisted Jim Jones by arguing against Miller's resistance to suicide, stating, "Let's make it a beautiful," and later citing possible reincarnation. After several exchanges in which Jim Jones argued that the Soviet Union exodus would not be possible, and also reactions from other temple members, Miller eventually backed down. However, Miller may have ceased dissenting when Jones confirmed at one point that the congressman has been murdered after the Airstrip Shooters returned. After Jim Jones confirmed that the Congressman was dead, armed guards began to take positions around the pavilion. And directly after this, Jim stated that the Red Brigade's the only one that made any sense anyways. And the Red Brigade showed them justice. According to an escaped Temple member, Odell Rhodes, the first to take poison was Roletta Paul and her 1-year-old infant. A syringe without a needle was used to squirt the liquid into the infant's mouth, and then Roletta took another syringe and squirted it into her own mouth. Stanley Clayton also witnessed mothers with their babies approach the tub with the poison. Clayton said that Jim also approached many adults for them to take the poison, and after some saw the effect that the poison had on those who were dying, they became reluctant to die. The poison caused death within 5 minutes for children, less for babies, and about 20 to 30 minutes for adults. After consuming the poison, persons were escorted down a wooden pathway and outside of the pavilion where they were left to die. In response to reactions of seeing the poison take effect on others, Jim Jones counseled, and he said, "Die with a degree of dignity. Lay down your life with dignity. Don't lay it down with tears and agony." He also said, "I tell you, I don't care how many screams you hear. I don't care how many anguished cries. Death is 1,000,000 times preferable to 10 more days of this life. If you knew what was ahead of you, you'd be glad to be stepping over tonight." Rhodes described a scene of both hysteria and confusion as parents watched their children die. He also stated that most present quietly waited their own turn to die, and many of the assembled Temple members walked around like they were in a trance. Survivor Tim Carter had suggested that, like a previous practice, that day's lunch of grilled cheese sandwiches may have been tainted with sedatives. The crowd was surrounded by armed guards, offering members the dilemma of either death by poison or death by gunshot. Cries and screams of children and adults are clearly heard on the tape recording that was made, and I will link that page below, but I didn't listen to it. I don't think I can listen to that. As more Temple members died, eventually the guards were called themselves to take the poison. When he was discovered, Jim Jones was found laying next to his chair in the pavilion, and he was found between two bodies. His head was cushioned by a pillow. His cause of death was a gunshot wound to the left temple, and according to Guyanese Chief Medical Examiner Leslie Motu at the time, it was consistent with being self-inflicted. The events of Jonestown was constituted the greatest single loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until the incidents of September 11, 2001. Just before the start of the final meeting in the pavilion, Gary and Lane were told that the people were upset with them. The lawyers were escorted to a house used to accommodate visitors. According to them, they talked their way past 2 armed guards, escaped into the jungle, and eventually made their way to Port Kaituma. While in the jungle near the settlement, they heard gunshots. This observation concurred with that of Clayton, who had heard the same songs while he was in the jungle, and he was sneaking back into Jonestown to retrieve his passport. Rhodes had volunteered to fetch a stethoscope, and he hid under a building. 2 more people who were intended to be poisoned survived. That was 79-year-old Grover David, who was hearing impaired, so he did not hear the announcement when they were called to the pavilion. But when he realized what was happening, he lay down in a ditch and played dead. 76-year-old Hyacinth Trash, she realized what was happening, and she crawled under a bed and hid there until the poisonings ended. People's Temple members did not only die at Port Kaituma Airstrip and Jonestown, there were also deaths recorded in Georgetown. In the early mornings of November the 18th, at the Temple headquarters in Georgetown, Temple member Sharon Amos received a broadcast from Jonestown informing her to take revenge on the Temple's enemies and then commit revolutionary suicide. Later, after the police arrived at the headquarters, Sharon took her children, Leanne, who was 21, Krista, 11, and Martin, who was 10, into the bathroom. Sharon, wielding a kitchen knife, took the lives of Krista Den Martin, and her daughter Leanne helped her to take her own life, after which Leanne turned the knife on herself and committed suicide. Stephen, Tim, and Jim Jr. eventually discovered their bodies after making their way to the temple headquarters in an effort to make their way back to Jonestown to stop the mass suicide. 914 of the 918 dead, including Jones himself, were collected by the United States military in Guyana, then transported by a military cargo plane to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, a location that has been used previously for mass processing of the dead from the Tenerife airport disaster. The last shipment of bodies arrived in the early mornings of November the 27th, 1978. The base's mortuary was tasked with fingerprinting, identifying, and processing the bodies. The base's resources were overwhelmed, and numerous individuals tasked with moving the bodies suffered with symptoms of PTSD. In August of 2014, the never-claimed cremated remains of 9 people from Jonestown were found in a former funeral home in Dover. As of September 2014, 4 of the remains have been returned to next of kin, but 5 still have not yet. Those 5 were publicly identified in an effort that family members would claim their remains. All 5 have remained unclaimed and have been interred at the Jonestown Memorial at Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland, California, along with the remains of approximately half of those who perished on November the 18th, 1978. Jim Jones attracted a large following to the People's Temple through sermons on tolerance, social responsibility, and community. As the church grew, however, the sermons on tolerance and equality were belied by his own increasing demands for personal loyalty and obedience. The extent of his authority meant that his eventual breakdown transformed his personal tragedy into one of the largest mass deaths in American history.